My name is Gregory Goll. I'm currently, in this current life, I'm the manager of projects and medical imaging services at a little healthcare system called WellStar out of Marietta, Georgia, which currently encompasses 13 hospitals. So when I started at WellStar, we were 11 hospitals, went down to 9. I went home one night, came back, and guess what? We are 13 hospitals. So healthcare is an ever-evolving climate, might be the best term for it. So the best thing, so where did this all begin as we're letting more people come in? Started at a place called the University of Michigan Medical Center, as they call it now, Michigan Medicine. And the first project I got into was a little thing called RHP, Replacement Hospital Project, that was, the hospital was built in 1926. And what happened was they went to the state of Michigan, and the hospital was built during the pre-World War II. During World War II, they kept adding slices to it. And they realized eventually that a 5-floor building that is now 13 floors is not really the best idea. So that's where all this began with me. And on the radiology side, I had no idea I would do this someday, but we had things called bid packs. Let me give that one to you. Let you ponder that one while I'm talking. Communication is everything. So anyways, the first bid pack that I got 3 coming right out of college was basically all the stuff nobody wanted, anesthesia, which nobody wanted, and radiology, which nobody wanted. So my goal was I had to do bid compliance for all these projects. For the hospital was a one and done for the state of Michigan. And they said, you will never, ever ask us for money again, ever. So, and fortunately over the years, this campus has metamorphosized into something I never envisioned back in the day. So basically what happens is people come to you and ask for something. And the biggest thing is clear communication. Does everybody understand what you're looking for? And this sums it up. So if any of you have done projects before, sums it up pretty well. In the end, all somebody wanted was a simple tire swing. And by the time it got convoluted through everybody else, there we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about, to keep you guys awake, the cost of project failures. So I've got multiple facets in my career. I started out as a biomed, weird biomed. I went and got a computer engineering degree. Then so I kept metamorphosizing through my career. There's a joke, I'm on my 5th life right now. Because actually I was a laser surgical specialist too. So, average project overrun, average cost of, the average cost overrun of 27%. 1 in 6 IT projects overrun 200%. You can see all this. Important thing we're pointing out is very rarely have I had a project that comes in overall on budget. And also the bad thing is some of the projects you'll see, believe it or not, you don't want to say it, but they're almost, you see from the beginning, they're doomed to fail. And the biggest thing you learn is it's not that anybody hasn't done what they're tasked to do. It's that somebody in the beginning didn't get clearly defined expectations of what they wanted to see as an outcome. Whoop, let me jump back. So some of these I'm going to go through here. Now, one disclaimer. Have I been PMI trained? Yes, quite a bit of PMI trained. Am I PMI certified? The answer is no. And the only reason why I didn't do that, I'm CBT certified, I'm CHTM certified. I get paid back for those. PMI training, nah. And I did that for a few years. It was $325 a year plus belonging to the local PMI chapter. And when I started, financially going through this, it's like, pick what you want to be certified in. And so I strongly recommend you do use them as a resource, Microsoft Project, things like that. So we're going to talk about is right off the bat, the phases of project management. Initiating, planning, executing, all these slides are available. So, a month from now, when you don't remember, you're in Orlando, you got them. And the biggest thing that you look at on the bottom here is the last one, closing. Nothing is finished until you've reached the outcome of that you've closed and met your goals. Project life cycle. Project life cycle, the phases that a project passes through from initiation to the final closure. Every project begins at some point and it has to end. And in some of my projects, I'll be honest with you, I did several database projects for CMMS systems because in theory, the project never closed, I consider it, because your hope was you had a fully functional system at the end. It never quite matched that. So you kept chewing, and some of the managers I worked with or directors said, yeah, we finished it. We got the software working. It's like, no, the software you can access, but it's not working until you get it working. It's my horror stories on CMMS systems. So the biggest thing right here, stakeholders. Any person or group that's affected by the outcome of a project or decision activity as a result of a project. So, the reports there, right there. So one of the things when I was talking about that first bid pack AO, we called it for radiology, that I learned that when you're dealing with this is, number one was like knowing who the stakeholders were. When I was given that piece of paper, they said, you need to go out as part of this project team, meet all the criteria that is in this document right here. And at that point, we didn't know who the end users were because they were still in another building, about probably a quarter mile from us at that point. But the importance of the stakeholders is knowing you met you're meeting what they've set you out for. And actually worked for, that was my first and second time I worked for a Navy chief. So I learned, I never was in the military, but I learned quickly. So, so sponsor a person that possibly or a group that provides resources support for a project. The biggest thing that, money. Any project changes, and go through what I want to do is I'll go through the slides and give you some of my horror stories or things we've overcome. So if everyone thinks these go great, they do, and then they don't. So project manager. Now this is a unique thing because remember I said I worked at the University of Michigan. My first exposure to a project manager was from a construction company called Barton Mallow. And I learned more from the person I should have never learned anything from, because every morning I got up and I was assigned to a person by the name of Russ. And he would direct me to wherever I had to be to go through bid compliance meeting with the vendor. And what I did learn in that time was he would walk me around, and part of his job was how much rebar goes in the floor of the hospital. I had no idea. I'm a young guy. I just graduated from college. What does it matter to me what's in the floor? Years later, I'm in imaging. Guess what? It means everything what's in the floor. So I learned a lot by being with people, paying attention in different situations. And where the next project manager came to play was years later, I was in charge of the biggest project, patient monitoring replacement project in the University of Michigan's history. We were the biggest in 1999 in the country. And I actually had my first exposure to a person named Gail Rowe, who now worked for GE. And that's the first person that made me realize there is a method to what we're doing. So, and this person, as we're in here, project manager, I always respect is he or she is the person who runs everything. I run the things in my lane, so I'm part of the project team, but ultimately that is the person who decides everything. Another fun one, project scope, the work that is done to deliver a product or service. Importance is a baseline. Project resources, tools, people. The most important thing I've ever had through my career is my team, my people. My most important project last night was making sure all my employees were paid by their time cards. So happy employees are the best. Data, relationships, internal, external staffing. So as we're talking about some of this, what can you leverage in your people? And biggest thing is knowing what your skill set of everybody you work with is. Sit down, have a point blank conversation of what you already may know their resumes, you may not, but we don't know is what they did before they became into the healthcare world. External staffing, I don't use a lot of external staffing for one simple reason. I found out that they tend to take longer to get online, and I'm better off paying my own group overtime. Vendor resources, what can a vendor provide? This has been getting more and more challenging over the years, as everyone can relate to, because vendors have less resources, and unfortunately, we're just talking about this outside, the skill set of the people that you're getting are not the skill set of the people you were getting 20 years ago. And I was talking to one of my friends, I'm not going to say how long I was in the profession, but it's 7 3/4 dog years. So I've decided to not use real years. I'm just going to count in dog years right now. So that'll give you a math problem. Relationships. Biggest thing with vendors is one of the things that I was taught actually during that one project I was mentioned, the 1999 project with the patient monitoring. We were given a strict guideline to deal with every vendor. And we made sure, like as everything was going along, every vendor had a meeting, like when we were doing the evaluations, to say, this is exactly what you'll do. This is exactly when you'll show up. And like, for different times, I actually had a bad reputation because I would give everybody 15 minutes to do something. And I had to give, if I gave you 15 minutes and you came back to me and said, I need 3 more minutes, it was either I had 1 or 2 choices. I cut you off at 15 minutes, or I have to start over and give you the extra 3 minutes, so everyone's fair. So making that relationship years and years, decades later, everybody remembers me as being just pretty straight by the books. If I gave you a sheet of paper, here's what I expect you to do. And it's worked out great. When you're talking to a vendor, remember I said be consistent. Set it, set your standard for all external interactions. Income inspection. One of the things that can go seriously wrong, this will deviate a little bit. Before I started working at my next life, which was a little trauma center called Erlanger in Chattanooga, Tennessee, we had a semi arrive. They had 27 pallets of equipment. They walked onto the semi and counted 27 pallets. There's one flaw right here, and you should have heard it. They walked onto the semi. They didn't count 27 pallets that came off the semi. 3 pallets remained on the semi. And 6 months later, they found those 3 pallets in Oregon. They were the central stations for all the patient monitoring. So, as we'll talk, initial inventory process, I had a rule that everything that comes off a truck, we're there to count it or move it. If not, given FedEx today, you're going to lose it. Anybody use FedEx? There we go. Project timelines. Did you read that one? Project management software. The best thing you can have is have some consistent software that everybody uses. We use Excel a lot. I've used Excel a lot in my career. This is an old master timeline, which is, universal. Everybody has these. So what we used to have is a construction meeting every Wednesday at WellStar that unfortunately encompassed everybody, which meant you would have to sit through all the stuff that wasn't yours just to get to it was 35 pages long. But the catch is main project manager was very good at updating everything. So you knew everything that was going on every week, so you're never surprised by, as long as you kept your sheet, you knew exactly what was going on. So risk analysis, here's one of my favorite things. It's an event or condition that happens that can have a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives. We already talked about that. You didn't catch all your inventory coming off the truck, guess what? You've got a negative risk. So the different types of risk, breakdown structure, appetite. How much can your hospital or employer take? Appetite. In my first life, Michigan, we had a lot of money at one point towards the end of it. So they were willing to assume a little more risk. Going forward to my county hospital, Erlanger, we were broke. The first thing I'd greet every vendor and say, hi, my name is Greg and I'm broke. So right off the bat, you knew. If you're trying to get money, you're at the wrong hospital. That's the Catholic hospital across town. So how much risk, like I said, how much can they stand? Documentation, progress notes, things like that. And deviate a little bit, where this became really important is we're doing, is I would get assigned things. I get assigned a project. We used to get called out and say, okay, we're, unfortunately I used to call it the Thursday evening, I'm not going home for dinner call, because we would get a call from the project manager and say, I need you over here to pick up a set of blueprints, or I need you to get a set of notes. And by Friday end of the day, you have to give me a budget for something. And in one case, it was actually the Wednesday. By Friday, I had to come up with a budget for an emergency room across town that had no blueprints, no construction done. And the only directive I had was go downstairs to our main Baroness campus, which was our main hospital, and duplicate that on the east side of town. It's like, okay. So what happened where that comes into play is when we did that initial documentation, I kept everything down and I said, okay, in writing, you told me what to do. And when we're talking about some of the things that teams, what you need to do is it's not who shows up, it's who's missing. And in that project in particular, the operative word of emergency department is who is missing. The doctor who was in control of the emergency room was never invited for 2 months, believe it or not. So what happened is we were documenting all this stuff, and I'll get more into that detail. We hit some things, we're going to talk about critical paths. So as things were going down, when you're doing these projects, critical paths are, basically a sequence of activities that define the longest path through a project. I said, you have these slides, you can read them. We'll talk about some scope creep. Now this is something, I'll finish that doctor real quick, because that it's going to tie in later. But what happened was, when I first met him, the original, and this isn't imaging, but this is just generally, we had a CT in there, we had a stress lab, and let's see, what else was there? 15 patient monitors, 2 separate areas. We had some trauma rooms. And what happened was, when it came backwards, nobody talked to the doctor and said, they came back to me and said, by the way, Greg, you have to lose half your monitors. We don't have the money. I said, okay. What they didn't know was, when I said, there's no doctor here. And I said, I'm just going to leave the wiring in place, because they don't know I left the wiring and the mounts in place. So where that came into play, when I first met that doctor, the first thing he said was in the meeting, he goes, I have 15 monitors. And I was sitting in the room and I'm going like, oh God, who's going to break this to him? So went on a break and I said, let me talk to you for a minute, Dr. Hamilton. And so what happened was, I said, the good news is, the bad news is you don't have 15 monitors. The good news is nobody knows I left the wiring in, so all I have to do is go out and buy the other 9 you're missing. He's like, thank you for thinking of that. And so Now you can imagine how much the cost would have been to run wiring, networking completely down the hall if that had not happened. I didn't get in trouble for it. It's like the old saying goes, know where your bodies are buried and don't let anybody else know. So scope change, and this is, basically something that keeps going on. You start one place and you end up, for some reason or another, especially now, reimbursements, at WellStar right now, we change, we're acquiring people, acquiring different practices. Remember I said Augusta all of a sudden materialized? Our claim to fame at WellStar was cancer, women. That's where I have more hologic equipment probably than anybody else in Georgia. What all of a sudden happened, we acquired a little place called the Medical College of Georgia and Augusta Children's. So now all of a sudden, guess what we are? We're pediatrics. And where I saw that coming was I got a call one day, and now this is easy to say. We're acquiring about 9 practices that are called pediatric orthopedics. And it's like, why am I running all over the state of Georgia for pediatrics? We're not a pediatric hospital. Guess what? We are now. So let's talk about compression, project crashing, fast tracking. When you're compressing, sometimes you have to, you're maintaining all the aspects of the project over just decreasing the timeline. Crashing is never good. You shorten the schedule duration, you add resources. Remember I said I don't like using external people. One of the reasons is for every dollar you spend, you tend to not get that value back out because you have to supervise the people more. Fast tracking, process of performing all tasks in parallel. Watching my time here. Dysfunctional. Who's ever had something that dysfunctional groups? Acceptance criteria. One of the things at the university like that, remember I said that radiology bid pack? I controlled 20% of the money that went to every vendor. So until I was happy, you got your 80 for getting your equipment on the dock, getting it installed. But until you met our punch down list, in that case, and I like this is the only time in my career when I was young, actually when I was the youngest, I had the most power. I look at it that way. Until everything was met on that punch list, you did not get your 20%, which, if you have the power to do that, that is great. So I had a lot of really mad vendors at me, might be the best term. Planning for installation, clear understanding of the project scope, definite timelines. That emergency room, you know how many years it took from that Wednesday emergency to get this done on Friday? 3 years later. And the only reason why they panicked is in Tennessee, we're a certificate of need state. And their certificate of need was going to expire and they had to break ground. So when they came up with this, that was one of the things that really scared me was I said, when are we going to do this? They said, in the future. And I'm like, in the future? So what I did, so no defined timeline. At that point, we only had our major project manager, Gary, and clearly defined, so basically a lot of planning was really hard to do. Build a project, remember I was telling you about that? Long-term, short-term, build it to fit. One of the things that everyone in my group did was they went to, when they did that budget on that project, I'll pick out no matter what modality it was, they went for current pricing. I'm going to my vendor, it's an emergency, how much does a CT cost today? They didn't judge what a CT costs in 3 years. So I was a little different. So I went back and said, okay, I'm going to do everything at list price, and I'm going to assume this is going to go 5 years. And so I added the value of money to it. So by the time this came to life, I was actually under budget. Everybody else in my group was over budget. So as we're talking predefined budget, has the scope been determined? Did you add everything to the budget? Selected vendors for the bid process? And this was one of the other ones that is actually pretty dangerous when you, I considered it, is everybody pretty much standardized on their equipment. Ideally in the world we are, practically in the world we're not. So one of the things we almost had, and this will come up, actually it's not in this, it's actually, the slides are in a different presentation to do. But what happened was, remember when it mentions in here vendors, bid process, one of the problems you can run into is if you're upside down in technology, people may, I'm a Philips house, I'm a GE house. What used to happen, especially in the world of Erlanger, is if you bought one device that was from your legacy vendor, it basically would shut down the ability to get other vendors, because what happened is they go, we bought this many dollars of this, whether it's biomed equipment or imaging equipment, and we're just going to give a carte blanche because we don't want to go back to it. We were governed by the state of Tennessee, the city council, basically Chattanooga, and the county. So we had three governing, actually four, because we had our own governing people. So what people did not want to do is you did not want to go back before the board and for the county. Fortunately, I never had to do that. That was my boss's job. So we're going to talk about this. Is the installation in area or, new area existing? That emergency room I was telling you about, it didn't exist from square up. Directly next to me, I was in an abandoned building that actually we'll talk about this real quick about installation in new area. We had a cath lab. Everyone knows what, in this building called the 3800 building. It was called the 3800 building because it was built in 1938. So if you think back in time, what did computers and cath labs look like in 1938? Yeah, pretty much. So what happened years later in this building, this floor was right below me. I was located in this building too. They took the cath lab out and they said, so we're talking about it, and I'm going to pick on my IT brothers here. So what they decided to do, they took the cath lab out. Cath labs are heavy, and we're going to turn this into a server farm. So the difference between servers and a cath lab is basically weight distribution. So when they started doing the load, started installing it without, basically looking at what the structure was, they quickly came to realize that if they put all the servers in the cath lab where they wanted to, the servers would on the fourth floor would be on the third floor in no time flat. And so that's why it becomes important to know, is this an existing area? What did you use it for? Payment terms, remember I told you about that, when are funds available? Organizational project, blueprint control. This was, no matter whether it's digital or not, one of the biggest issues we had was when we had those meetings and actually this metamorphosized, we had to call out that if we had a project, everybody had to show up. If we had the physical prints, we all had our slot in construction, and we all had to pull our blueprints out of that slot. So we all had the same blueprint. So if all of us were in a meeting, we all had the same revision. You know how many times I showed up to a meeting and we didn't have the same revision? A lot. Notebook, that was something, remember I told you about that doctor? Back in the day, I used to keep a binder with me because I'd be in places where there's no computer. And that was where if somebody made a decision where that, it was actually our facilities director made the decision for me to cut my budget for those monitors, I had them initial on my sheet of paper when we were there and say, I approve you remove this from the budget. So I was able to flip back to that doctor and say, here's when it was done and here's who did it. So I wasn't the villain. So, stored access, make sure everybody has access to everything. Remember I said that revision? Back in the day, we don't use a lot of those anymore, do we? But virtually we have a whole bunch of those things on our files, and that's where we have now. And something that, I've had people, before you volunteer for a leadership role in something, when I went back to that project in 1999 at the University of Michigan, what happened was by that time, I had metamorphosized where I was in charge of a lot of the ICU monitors. They went back and they said, okay, we need a volunteer from the audience to basically run the bid, run the install of this massive system. Everybody, I was one of the still younger people. So they went out and they said, we need a volunteer from the audience. Nobody volunteered. And I said, this is my life's blood. This will eventually come back on me if this isn't done right, because I'm in charge of thoracic ICU. Anything that was a heart was mine. So I volunteered to take on that leadership role. So learned a lot of work though, and your communication ability. The biggest thing I learned is, any of you talk geek? Computer people? The biggest thing I learned sitting in Erlanger was, one of the nurses pointed this out to me. She said, did you ever realize why everybody always wants to sit on your right? And I said, no, not at all. She said, because when all the IT people are talking, we can't understand a damn word they're saying. I was taking all my notes I'm right-handed, and they'd be reading my notes. And occasionally they'd tap me on the shoulder and, can you explain this in English? And I was like, I don't get it. And she goes, you translate geek. We can't understand a word they're saying. And it's pretty true. And actually, that was another one where we were talking about those blueprints. What they did do, and I got a call from one of my nurses crying one night, was they gave her a set of blueprints before I was fully engaged in the projects. And she said, they gave me a set of blueprints and they want me to mark all the power outlets and all the network connections. And she said, I don't know how to do it. And I said, run them up here, bring them to me. I said, I don't tell you how to take care of patients. You shouldn't be telling me where to put my network lines. That's an expectation that should never happen. Don't put people in situations, because in a situation like that, when I was talking to her, that was probably a career. If this went wrong, guess who they're going to blame? Her. But anyways, we changed the whole way we did things because of that. Internal budgeting, back in that life, I had the ability to build stuff back. That is the best thing known to mankind, because if you're explaining labor budgeting, things like that, how do you explain? I'm thinking at one point, I had my crews working, probably anywhere from a couple hours a night overtime to potentially even double shifts, but how do you pay for that? So how soon can back billing begin? In this life, we haven't got to back billing in my imaging, because we don't actually get involved in the weeds that much. This thing right here, we're going to talk about some lessons learned. What this happened right here, as we're talking about this, is when I was doing a project at Erlanger, we had a discussion about basically where we need a core drill through 5 floors of a hospital. And so I brought all my vendors down. Actually, I'm probably going to finish way early. And what happened was, the first thing that I got really kind of almost yelled at by our facilities director was that, you are not going to drill through my floors. I said, that's not what I asked. What I told you was, my vendor here needs to go from this floor to this floor. And they said, okay, well, we use our own company. So what happened is, when we went through, one night I was sitting in my shop, and I heard over the PA, communication on the 9th floor is down. I said, no big deal. Phone system, computers, that's not my problem. Guess what those little holes are for? Yep. So, I'm still sitting there, and all of a sudden I hear over the PA system, communication, phone system, 8th floor, down. And I'm going like, there's something wrong here, but it's not my problem because I'm biomed imaging. It's not my stuff. So as this went on, So I finished my night out, and I was riding down, and I was actually riding down the elevator with the core drill team. I saw their nice little core drill, and I said, "Oh, you guys must be drilling my holes for the patient monitoring system." And they said, "Yes." And I was like, "Okay, no big deal. I know they're here." So lo and behold, about an hour later, I get a call and said, "All this is down." And so lo and behold, we found out those all did have cute little wires in them that they pulled out. So the next morning when I came in, I said, because first thing I did was I was on the 6th floor. We were going up to the 9th floor. I walked into my main communications closet. I looked up, beautiful hole all the way up. So I said, you know what? I wonder if any of these things are still sitting on the floor in the communications room. So guess what? They're my book. I still have those today. Those are probably 15-year-old bookends. So, but the point of the matter is what they're supposed to do is basically check, just like, they have their own ground penetration, so they're not supposed to hit this. Some reason they did. So and so that's, like I said, it was a lot of chaos, because you can imagine a patient tower of 5 floors completely losing all phones and computer systems. So let's talk about some more stuff. Inventory, but what went well is we're talking about a lot of this stuff, a lot of people that worked with me over time, they said, "Are you ever happy?" And I said, about finishing something. I said, really, it's not that we didn't do, something, what something didn't go well. If we think everything went perfect, we're not looking hard enough at what we did, because there's always something we could have done better. One good example, like when we were doing a major project for anesthesia at Erlanger, we had to do, basically every night we had to do a different core of patient monitor replacement, upgrades to a patient monitoring system. One of the things that they had, and one of my counterparts over here mentioned booms. How many of you guys work with booms? Got one person. If you don't know, do you know what a boom is, everybody? So what happened was, when we were working on this project at Erlanger, we realized that there was a boom set directly above an anesthesia machine that could not be removed cost effectively. What happened was, and this was actually a huge, basically in our world, a huge win. And what happened was, we had to come up with, actually, I came up with it. We had to come up with a new way of mounting the monitors so they would fit under a fixed boom. And so I have a little bit of automotive experience, machine shop experience. Went to a company in Chattanooga and said, "I need you guys to take the top of this anesthesia machine," took it off, and we notched all the mounts, created a whole, new way of mounting everything. So we cleared this boom by about that much. And then, so what went really well on that, the doctor, I'll cut to the chase. Number one, that setup ended up in Tech Nation probably about 15 years ago as a centerfold. I said when I was in high school, I wanted one of my cars to be in a hot rod magazine as a centerfold. My anesthesia machine made it. So, but what the doctor, years later, I was talking to him, and he goes, I went to a conference, and I said, and he said, I was talking about what you guys did. He said, they've never even heard of a biomed department or anybody doing what you guys pulled off, because we would start at night when they left, and what the mandate was, when they came back in the morning, there wasn't a shred of paper on the floor. There was nothing. You were like little elves. You didn't know and actually with the vendors, even, we had a lot of fun. At GE, we had a lot of fun. Good experiences, can be built upon. Bad experiences, the best thing in life that you learn is you can't learn to succeed until you learn how to fail. And so share good, both the good and bad practice experiences. Many times the best lessons learned, like I said, are, listening to others. Remember I was talking about that guy, Russ? I learned to this day, yeah, and this is something I couldn't take a picture of, but I had an MRI that decided to self-destruct. Now, what would that entail? There's a design flaw in this MRI that basically when you took the patient cradle and put it underneath it, the table would raise and lower. If you misalign the table, basically the MRI could go down and crush the table into the floor. What happened was nobody realized that the floor wasn't reinforced properly. So all of a sudden one day I got a call that there's this massive crack and one end of the MRI is trying to move. And so we had a little discussion back and forth about that. And actually years later, it turns out that I won't name the vendor because remember I said, my employer doesn't like that. So, but it ended up being a recall because it was a design flaw that went back to the actual MRI tech that was doing it that said, you're being basically not caring about what you're doing. And it's like, no, there's no guidelines to make sure this table, when you're transitioning the patient on and off of the MRI, so you would just roll it in and you could be missing by only this much. And all of a sudden it's lowering down and it's just pressing on itself. So, and that was, actually I had a really pointed conversation with my vendor about that because they wanted to keep our MRI in service and I refused to do it. I said, no, we're not going to do this until we get somebody in here to look at what went wrong. And one of the things is knowing your wheelhouse too, is I'm in charge of the MRIs. I'm not in charge of building floors. I'm not a construction engineer. We rely on somebody to professionally do that. So have a plan and be careful. Before any work begins, have a plan of exactly what is being done. Know your expected role. And the biggest thing you don't want to do, the boundaries of your role. The biggest thing is, remember I said, we know how to talk geek. More people want us to be system administrators. Don't do it. Two reasons. Number one, it's not your wheelhouse. Number two, you're not going to get paid for it. Do not take on tasks you're unable to control. Like I was saying, do not make promises you can't keep. Make a contingency plan. So what I always, most of the people that have worked with me, I always have a plan A. If something goes wrong, I have a plan B. So I always make sure I have I expect something to go wrong. Unfortunately, I hate being right all the time. Purchasing equipment without user input. And I just had a recent one like this. We're on the imaging world. We had everybody dealing with point of care devices today, like ultrasounds. What we had a doctor initiative come through that he bought a bunch of ultrasounds. We didn't know, well, basically I saw them on the capital approval. And what they would be used for is spinal blocks. And it was like, no big deal. Anesthesia use them. They're not networked. They're not in my PAC system. Lo and behold, what happened was, all of a sudden, within a few months, they had to be in the PAC system. They had to be wireless. Nobody spec'd it out. And so the worst thing that happened is I call that one the Christmas present that nobody wanted. Because we ended up with all these ultrasounds being deployed and as they're arriving, actually I had a conversation with a company here. I said, it probably gave you guys the worst black eye because what happened was, as soon as they got approved for this, a doctor champion was there. He bought it for all these sites, these ultrasounds. They showed up with no POs on them. So what happens to your receiving people when they don't have a PO? They don't know what it came from. The first person they pick up the phone is, they're calling me and say, Greg, what have you done to us? So anyways, what ended up with that one was, just recently, probably within the last 60 days, I ended up with an ultrasound. We made a joke that it was a point of care block initiative. My hospitals called me up and said, either you come and get this or we're going to throw it away. Signed up with a brand new ultrasound in my shop. I said, I'll take any good equipment, I reuse it, or we use it as a spare. Not taking the time to properly verify information, details, contacts, measurement. This is another issue we just had recently. I had somebody with one of our urology suites. They thought they measured. Remember I said that blueprint revision is a big deal? They did not measure. Like in any building, there's these little column things that tend to support the building. They didn't take that into account when they were designing the suite. So when the company, I won't pick on them either, and our facilities people looked at it, by the time they realized what they had done, the room was actually 6 inches too short. And unfortunately, when you have a column, like a support column, it doesn't move. So I remember that old saying, measure twice, cut once. There you go. So lack of engagement from the clinical staff. This is a big issue that unfortunately keeps happening over and over again. I remember working for another hospital system in Michigan called McLaren, and they made a promise to get, when they're doing some projects, we would get all the clinical people involved in the process. Corporately, they decided after the fact that takes too long. So we had 13 hospitals, like similar to WellStar, and my hospital was the cash cow Detroit. It was a place called Macomb. As all the nurses were looking forward to it, I made promises. I said, no problem, guys. I've been guaranteed that you will have input. Guess what didn't happen? They got no input whatsoever on, and so remember, I keep saying, the Christmas present nobody wants. That's where that all comes from. Making decisions without proper approvals. Going back to the 1999 patient monitor project. I don't know if any of you guys remember, any of you guys old enough to remember when Marquette Electronics existed. Got one guy nodding his head. Two, you're admitting it. Okay, good. I don't feel that old then. So anyways, what happened was we had a telemetry unit. I'm going to switch into the biomed world. And what happened was we had little scopes that went in the rooms. So you could see the patient at the central station, you could see him in the room. So what happened was one of my nursing units said, we like this monitor, called it Eagle, which went from $1,000 little scope to a $14,000 basically mini ICU monitor. And I said, well, we don't have the budget for that. And so like with the approvals, I said, I'm not approving anything. That goes to somebody else. Remember I said you have the have and the have-nots. And the worst thing was that happened there. They went back to their manager and said, we would like this here because we feel, they made the clinical case for it. Said, cool, but realize now that this isn't a $14,000 increase. This is a $300,000 increase worst case. And there used to be a commercial back in the 70s about, I used to call it Clairol. You tell one friend about a shampoo, they tell their next friend, they tell their next friend. All my nurses, because I was in charge of the cardiology, I said, as soon as this group gets us approved, one of the nurses is going to go on the next floor and say, guess what we're getting? Then it's going to go to pediatrics and say, guess what we're getting? So the important thing is never agree to anything that you cannot back up. Let's let you guys read through these a little bit, or I can do it here. Scopeless is hopeless. If you don't know what you're doing, you're throwing money away. Focus on time, money, cost, not quality. There's an old saying, you can either do it fast or you can do it cheap. You can't do it fast and cheap. Get it done yesterday. Know the right thing. Don't analyze the problems. Don't listen to people like the experts you have. The biggest thing, going back to one of the projects we were doing at Erlanger, we had some old ORs that everyone thought they were full of asbestos. And we were getting ready to renovate them. Nobody realized that 10 years before, we had removed all the asbestos. So we had this whole big EPA thing going on that really, didn't need to happen. We had expert people saying, hey, this stuff's clear, nothing, there's nothing you guys need to do. But you're ignoring what, basically your customer. Don't launch a project if you don't know anything. What does anyone else need to know? Don't thank your team. The biggest thing I always say is the people. I'm just a manager. I'm just a director. The guys who do everything are the people who supported me back in the day. I made my goal was always to make sure that we were doing a good job so our manager could present us in a positive way. People ought to know what to do. Never assume people know what to do. Avoid big problems. All our projects fail. One of the things I do is I watch my teams. If you have somebody who's really negative, I avoid giving them assignments. So we always used to pick our teams very carefully because part of it is how everything goes off. Remember I mentioned that doctor? Everybody in that group knew what we were doing. Everyone was real positive. You're working 16 hours a day. It's real easy to not be positive.